Marianne, isn't you?
Yeah, I'm waiting for, are the participants in? I'm waiting for admits to come in. Okay, great. So welcome everyone to this workshop that's jointly sponsored by the UC Davis Center for Poverty and Inequality Research and the Global Migration Center. I'm Marianne Page, Professor of Economics and the Director of the CPIR, which I co-founded in 2011 with a large grant from the US Department of Health and Human Services. The mission of the CPIR is to facilitate nonpartisan academic research on poverty and inequality in the US, disseminate this research, and train the next generation of poverty and inequality scholars. And I'm delighted to be co-hosting this workshop with the Global Migration Center, also a multidisciplinary center on campus directed by Giovanni Perry and created to produce fact-based knowledge through research related to international migration and vulnerable immigrants. We'll put the links to our respective centers in the chat, and we'll encourage you to take a look at what our centers do. Giovanni is going to say a few words about the structure of our workshop and how we're going to run the Q&A, as well as a few words about our conference theme, which is California's post-pandemic recovery, policies and unique challenges for vulnerable populations. But let me say that for myself, sorry, just a weird thing just happened to my screen. Well, the genesis of this workshop for me was that the recognition, there's a recognition for me at least, that while many measures of California's economy suggest that we've done remarkably well 2 years after the pandemic, we also know that the recovery is not being experienced equally across all sectors, and that vulnerable groups stand to fall further behind their more advantaged peers, even as the state continues to roll out investments that support economic growth. And with this in mind, I believe that academic research, not economic research, that rolled off strangely off my tongue, when it's combined with the unique perspectives of policymakers, advocates, and other stakeholders, can play an important role in helping California lead the country in developing and implementing policies that work towards leveling the playing field. I want to thank all of our speakers for participating, and especially our three panelists who agreed to share their perspectives with us today. Dan Torres, the Program Director of Immigrant Rights for the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund. Manuel Pastor, Director of the University of Southern California Equity Research Institute, and Shuming Cheer, who's the Deputy Director of Programs at the California Immigrant Policy Center. And I'll provide more information about them and all of the speakers as we move through the program. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Giovanni.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, all the speakers and the panelists. I want to welcome everybody to this workshop today. So the idea today of joining forces between the Center for Poverty and Inequality Research and the Global Migration Center is to bring in the research of some of our affiliates, some of our current and past affiliates or affiliates who are in Davis and affiliates who have gone to do research elsewhere, who will help us understand the recent evolution of vulnerable population and how the policies which were targeted to them have been effective or not, and how the COVID pandemic has changed things on the ground and how we are recovering out of this. For this, we thought that to have a nice picture, we should have thought about population which are vulnerable from an economic point of view because they have a low socioeconomic status, populations which are at the margin because of their legal status potentially, population who have a hard time sometimes being integrated because of outsiders, immigrants, and also to try to have a look at children, how the school system and children has coped with some of the consequences of the COVID crisis. And for this, we have divided this into a presentation that will touch research focused on policies and recent evolution during and after COVID of the economic and social status of some of these populations. So the rules of today's presentation will be that each academic presenter has the floor for 20 minutes, and then there will be 10 minutes of questions that I will moderate. People can put their questions in the chat, and I will be monitoring the chat, but we are going to leave the presenters 20 minutes to present, and then the rest of the panel, and a question in the chat will be used in the following 10 minutes to generate a question and answer session for each one of the speakers. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce the first speaker, and we're going to move into the presentation. The first speaker, I'm very happy to introduce Diane Charlton, Professor Diane Charlton, who is a professor at University of Montana. She was a PhD student here at UC Davis, and she will talk about farm labor, which has been and continue to be a group with specific issues very much linked to immigrant and undocumented immigrant, because many of them are, and we will hear from her how they have been coping with COVID and the recent evolution. Diane, the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Giovanni, and thank you to everyone who organized this panel. So as Giovanni mentioned, I will discuss the farm workforce, and of course during the pandemic we discussed labor as either essential or not essential, and farm work obviously is essential, and I think really gave a society a chance to really look at a part of the workforce that I don't think we often think about, but we're really dependent upon. And I will also talk about how fewer people work in agriculture as economies develop, and Mexico has been the primary source of labor to the United States for many years for agriculture, but fewer rural Mexicans are working in agriculture as time goes on. So the pandemic and farm employment, agricultural employment was down in 2020 compared to 2019. We don't have really great statistics on farm employment numbers, but looking at the quarterly census of employment and wages, which records numbers of workers based on unemployment insurance filings, they recorded 33,983 fewer crop and crop support employees in June 2020 compared to 2019. So some of those states include H2A, agricultural guest workers. Some don't, but we can be confident that farm employment was down. H2A employment was up. It increased by 17,647 certified positions in 2020 compared to 2019. But obviously, even if QCW does include H2A in some states and others not, the increase in H2A is not sufficient to fill in that gap of fewer workers in 2020. And as you can see, H2A growth has been growing pretty steadily since about 2011. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. So farm work and COVID-19, addressing some of the risk, uncertainty, and some of the unanswered questions that we have about COVID-19 and what kind of risk farm workers might have been exposed to. I don't think we have really great answers for this, but we know that agricultural activities are very time sensitive, and some of them are very labor intensive. So there's a substantial risk for farm employers. Will they have enough workers to actually harvest crops when they need them if there is an outbreak of COVID-19 at a really critical time? And farm workers might be more vulnerable to COVID-19 spread. I can think of a few reasons that they might be particularly vulnerable. Many of them live in very dense living quarters, so they may not be able to isolate very easily. And they have limited access to healthcare. According to the National Agricultural Workers Survey in 2016, only 50% of crop workers actually had health insurance. That doesn't include H2A workers, so there could be a little bit of noise in that response. It's also a higher risk population. Most of them are Hispanic, and an estimated 81% of farm workers are Hispanic. If we include H2A workers, that'd be even higher. And Hispanics seem to be more susceptible to more severe cases of COVID-19. And there's also a lot of migration within the farm workforce. So if people are moving from one location to another, we might have been concerned or might still be concerned about spreading a virus from one location to another. I looked at whether there was an association between month-to-month variation in fruit, vegetable, and horticultural employment within US counties and new COVID-19 cases. So I looked at historical employment because historical employment was not affected by COVID-19 directly. And I controlled for month fixed effects, which effectively they absorb any month-to-month variation at the national level. And I was focusing on FVH employment, fruit, vegetable, and horticultural employment, because it's very seasonal and often labor intensive. So here's just a map of FVH employment in July 2019. So July was the peak month of FVH employment in 2019 in most years as well. So not surprisingly, California had a very high FVH employment in July. Central Valley there, Washington, Oregon, a little bit in Michigan and the Northeast, and particularly in Florida as well. So you get some of the geographic variation in FVH employment. What I found was that 100 additional workers in the historical monthly FVH workforce were associated with 2.27 to 4.54% more COVID-19 cases within US counties. That translates to 15.78 to 18.65 additional COVID-19 cases per 100,000 individuals in the county workforce, and 0.21 to 0.34 deaths per 100,000 people. All of those results were significant at the 1% level of confidence, which means that these are very precise estimates and that we are very confident that they are not equal to zero. So very confident that there was a positive effect or a positive association. I don't want to say effect because we don't know the causal mechanisms, but there's a very confident that there was a positive association between FVH employment and new COVID-19 cases and deaths within US counties. And then I broke it down to the crop level, which we lose some of the statistical power when we do that. But a couple things I want to note here. One was I didn't find a significant association between grains and other mechanized crops and new COVID-19 cases, which doesn't surprise me given that those are much less labor-intensive crops. But in particular, I did find this positive and statistically significant relationship between employees of farm labor contractors and COVID-19. And that stood out to me because historically, farm labor contractors have served this purpose of connecting farm employers to farm employees when it's difficult for employers to find workers. And so they've been a very critical component of this farm labor market to reduce frictions in linking employees to employers. And as I mentioned previously, fewer Mexicans are wanting to work in agriculture. It might be difficult to find farm workers. And if farm labor contractors, one of the primary mechanisms of matching employees to employers, are also susceptible to this risk of COVID-19. One of the mechanisms that we've traditionally relied on to match employees to employers might have the same kinds of risks. So this leads me to ask, is this a turning point for farm labor management? One of the major changes that we saw in 2020 was employers seeking out improved worker safety measures. Some of these were probably temporary, some of them were very costly, some of them might be more permanent. So there's kind of this question and this trade-off of how costly were these measures, and would it be more cost effective for these farm managers to actually reduce labor inputs and maybe invest in labor saving technologies? And so looking a little more broadly at the farm labor market, the cost of labor in agriculture has been rising for many years. So this is just looking from 1990 to 2019, real inflation adjusted US farm wages rose steadily, particularly in the 2000s. And so farmers have noticed for quite a long time that this input is becoming more expensive. So who are farm workers? Who actually works in agriculture on the fields. Most US farm workers today are foreign born. If we included H2A in here, these data are taken from the National Agricultural Workers Survey, doesn't include H2A. So if we included H2A are roughly 10% full-time equivalent crop workforce in the United States. So more than 3/4 of crop workers in the United States are foreign born, roughly 2/3 from Mexico, maybe a little more than 2/3 when we would include H2A in here. Few domestic workers, people domestically born in the United States, work in agriculture today. That was not always the case. If we were to go back to 1920, almost 1/3 of the US population worked in agriculture. But by 2015, only 1.4% of US employees were employed directly on farm. So the United States went through this transition of many people working in agriculture to very few people working in agriculture, and we actually import workers to work on our farms so we can continue to produce these labor-intensive crops. The United States is not alone in this. This agricultural transformation has occurred in most developed countries around the world, and it's occurring right now in less developed countries, including Mexico. So immigrants supply the farm work to most developed countries. Numerous examples: New Zealand bringing guest workers from the Pacific Island nations, Canada from the Caribbean and Mexico, Spain from Morocco, Latin America, Romania, and other countries, South Africa from Zimbabwe, and Mexico even brings guest workers from Guatemala to work on their farms at the same time that they export workers to work on US farms. So Mexico's in this interesting transition of providing farm workers to the United States while also bringing farm workers to their own farms from Guatemala. So what happens when rural Mexicans leave farm work? So we've depended on this labor force for many years. What happens when fewer rural Mexicans actually want to work in agriculture? So we can look at some of the historic responses to reduced farm labor supply. For example, the Bracero program was a guest worker program between Mexico and the United States during World War II, and it continued after World War II ended and ended abruptly in 1964. And when the Bracero program ended, Clemens, Lewis, and Postal found that there was increased capital use on farms in counties that had been more dependent on Bracero workers before it ended. Another quasi-experiment was the Legal Arizona Workers Act in 2008. Arizona passed some of the most stringent immigration enforcement policies in the country in 2008. And so a study shows that families increased their supply of family labor to their own farms after this, this series of legislation was enacted. And then a number of studies have looked at county 287G policies as a quasi-experiment. These were immigration enforcement policies implemented at the county level in various counties around the country from 2005 to 2012. They allowed local law enforcement to cooperate with ICE to detect and detain unauthorized immigrants. And so studies show that after these policies were implemented, there was an increase in the capital share of inputs on farms, reduced farm incomes, reduced vegetable acreage. Again, vegetables are very labor intensive. Reduced milk production. Dairies are also very labor intensive. A number of dairies within the county, and increased labor efficiency and technology use on those dairies. So those are some historic examples of how farms appear to adjust to reduced supply of farm workers. And in fact, there is a lot of evidence that the farm labor supply is tightening and Mexico is transitioning out of farm work. So the share of US agricultural workers who participate in follow the crop migration, moving from farm to farm as the harvest progresses, that has fallen by more than 60% since the late 1990s. So as you can imagine, even if the full pool of workers were to remain the same, if workers are less migratory, as an employer, I might have a very difficult time finding seasonal employees when I need them. The incidence of localized farm labor shortages appears to be increasing. It's difficult to empirically define a labor shortage. However, Hertz and Zanizer find numerous cases of increased farm wages and decreased farm employment from 2007 to 2011, suggesting that there were labor shortages. Fewer Mexicans are coming to the United States. So labor migration depends critically on these migration networks. I'm much more likely to migrate to another country if I know someone there who can help me with housing, help me find a job, but those networks are shrinking. So net Mexican US migration has been 0 or negative since 2010, and we would expect that to impact the farm labor supply as well. And then finally, some work that I did with Ed Taylor from UC Davis, we found that rural Mexicans were transitioning out of farm work at a rate of about 150,000 workers per year from 1980 to 2010 by analyzing household survey data nationally representative of rural Mexico. So Mexico's going through this agricultural transformation that the United States went through, and fewer people are wanting to work in agriculture, but also help explain why we see these rising farm wages in the United States. So what can the United States do as farm labor becomes less certain, the supply becomes tighter? So one option would be to try to streamline and expand the H2A agricultural guest worker program. This figure here comes directly from the US Department of Labor, a flow chart of how to actually file for H2A workers. There are a lot of steps in this process, and I think my favorite part is when you get to the end of this flow chart, it says, congratulations, you are ready to file with the USCIS. You don't even have an H2A worker yet. So this is a complicated process, and farm employers have complained for many years that it's just too complex to use. Despite the complexity of this program and the costs associated with it, H2A employment still tripled from 2006 to 2019. So I think there might be some hope that there's increasing use of the H2A program, even though there have been many efforts to streamline this program in the past. Maybe with increased interest, maybe there's optimism that it might improve in the future. Another option could be to recruit workers from further abroad. I hear people talk about this option often. I think we have to keep in mind if we're going to try to recruit workers from further south, from Central America. The Central American rural population is much smaller than that of Mexico, so this is a limited supply. And Mexico and other Central American countries are competing to employ those workers as well. So limited supply there. We'd probably have to go even further abroad. Up here, I live in Montana. A lot of the grain growers up in northern Montana and North Dakota actually bring H2A workers from South Africa. So it's a long ways to go, but those workers work primarily on machinery. So they're driving combines. And you can imagine that the value added of that worker when they're working with this big machinery is quite high. So if we have enough value added for the worker, it might make sense to recruit workers from further abroad. Another potential solution would be to import more labor-intensive crops from countries that have lower wages. So labor is very expensive in the United States. So you can imagine that countries with lower wages would have a comparative advantage in growing these labor-intensive crops. I think we will see more importing of these labor-intensive crops, but I imagine that Americans still really value being able to consume domestically grown, hand-picked fruits and vegetables. So to the extent that consumers are willing to pay a premium for domestic fruits and vegetables, I don't think we're going to see these crops disappear. And then the other option is to mechanize. And we've seen some amazing breakthroughs in agricultural technology in the past few years. A lot of progress in terms of digital technologies and precision agriculture. I imagine that we will see some robotics in the future. There are a number of engineers working to create a robot that can detect ripe strawberries and pick them without a human hand. So the tasks that engineers are attempting to accomplish in agriculture are becoming quite complex. These aren't ready for commercial use yet, but from what I understand, engineers have made some amazing breakthroughs. There are examples of integrated weed management systems that can robotically remove intra-row weeds and reduce hand weeding times by 20 to 40%. And there's also some really amazing examples that involve plant scientists who breed fruits and vegetables that can be mechanically harvested. So I pulled this article in 2015, and then I learned that my sister is actually good friends with this farmer who developed this grape that dries naturally on the vine. So no one even has to go in and cut the canes for these grapes to dry on the vine, and then they can mechanically go in and harvest them. I don't know that the sun cream is used commercially, but I think it shows some of the creativity in plant breeding and mechanization. I think it's important to keep in mind, even as risks associated with hiring workers in the face of this pandemic increase, and as we have these risks of just fewer people wanting to work in agriculture, that doesn't mean that there will be no demand for farm labor. Even if we mechanize, we will need workers who can work with the machinery that we're thinking about here. So we're seeing real wages rise. We're going to have to increase the marginal value product of labor as wages rise. So we're going to have to make those workers more productive. We're likely going to do that through capital investments. So who will be the farm workers of the future, and how do we prepare people to work in agriculture? I imagine we're going to see more mechanical engineers and more technicians and managers who can adapt even if production becomes more rigid and streamlined. So as a society and as the agricultural industry is looking at some of these changes in the agricultural labor force, I think we really have to think about training agricultural workers for the future. So thank you, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Diane, for this very nice overview of the evolution in the U.S. agriculture and agricultural farm labor force. I have a question to kick off the floor here, and then we'll definitely open up. You can write your questions in the chat if you have, or you can raise your hand if you have a question. So you already kind of hinted at this idea that it's going to become harder. So as we exit from the pandemics, one thing that everybody's talking about are shortages of workers in all sectors, in many sectors, which require manual type of labor or simple type of labor. And what people have in mind really are hospitality, restaurant, but also healthcare assistant, elderly assistants, disabled assistant. Those are jobs that in principle are not requiring a lot of skills. So in a sense, agriculture will, some of the agricultural workers, what I'm saying, would be potentially be attracted by this type of jobs, which on average pay more and on average are less demanding and less dangerous than those. In a sense, I feel like the U.S. agriculture has had in part a captive labor force with a lot of immigrants who had very few other options, maybe because of their status, maybe because, and now some of them are becoming older. So how do you think about this? Number one question is, do you really think that the salaries in agriculture will increase significantly? You showed a chart, you know, minimum wages in many cities now have gone above $15, and some companies are paying minimum wages which are higher than $20. Can the U.S. agriculture shoulder this increase in wages? So is it reasonable, or will the mechanization, you think, take over? And the second is, I mean, in a sense, we should hope that some of these, so we should always hope that, you know, workers move to better opportunities, that they increase their options. And maybe agricultural worker will be a labor force that is only temporary by nature. If these people have better options, they will move out. And so aging as an agricultural worker maybe is something that we will not see. We will just need a revolving labor force, maybe coming from abroad and then finding other type of jobs. What do you think? Do you think COVID has accelerated this a little bit, and what do you see the future?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that there are so many opportunities in the non-farm sector right now, and that that competition is going to force farms to pay higher wages. There are studies that suggest that farms, say in California, that grow these more labor-intensive crops don't have the profit margins to increase wages by more than, say, 2%. I think Timothy Richards, 2018, came up with about 2%. So the only way to raise wages as much as I think we're probably going to have to see here is through mechanization. So like I said, that doesn't mean we're going to eliminate all of the workers. We'll have fewer workers. Those few workers are going to be paid more, and those few workers are going to be very productive because they would be helping to operate a machine that can harvest as much as many people. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of challenges here because the crops that are easy to mechanize have already been mechanized, but I think there are some really encouraging examples. I remember talking at a conference about 5 years ago about Mexico transitioning out of farm work, and a broccoli grower came to me and she said, there's just no way that you can mechanize harvesting broccoli. It's too hard. We've been playing with it and you can't do it. Well, I went to a conference last fall, and someone from Western Growers told me excitedly about these experiments they're doing with this new broccoli harvester. So it's challenging, but I think particularly as these pressures are coming on the agricultural industry, there's more incentive to come up with innovative solutions.
Do you think that with mechanization and automation, there will be some kind of good jobs generated in agriculture, those that you mentioned in terms of a kind of a one-step up type of jobs, or really the net effect will be that there will be even fewer jobs in agriculture?
I think there will be fewer jobs and better jobs is what I would expect. So, I mean, bending over a strawberry field sounds very physically demanding and uncomfortable to me to do that for 8 hours a day, day after day, or 10 hours a day, as many of these workers do. But helping to operate a robot that harvests strawberries sounds like a much more comfortable job, and should be better paying, as the operator would be responsible for harvesting a much larger quantity of strawberries. So I think there is a silver lining in here, but I think it is a major challenge for the agricultural industry. In terms of having a sort of a revolving door of young workers coming from other countries to work in agriculture, historically, that's what we've really had in the United States. Phil Martin, also from UC Davis, has written a lot about the revolving door. And it's actually not until recently that we've really seen the average wage, or sorry, not the average wage, the average age of farm workers increase, because young people don't want to work in agriculture anymore. And so we're starting to see that mean age is increasing. My brother-in-law has a farm, and they've been working with the same family of workers for a long time. All of their children went to Fresno State. They're not coming to work on the farm.
Thank you. Other questions for Diane?
I have a quick question related to the mechanization. And how much training it takes to be able to use some of these machines, and whether we might have a what's the word I'm looking for, a gap in terms of, so you talk about the high wage job, fewer workers, but they'll be paid higher wages. Do we have reasons to believe that our current labor market in California is equipped to do that kind of training, or is that a gap?
I'm kind of guessing here, but I think there might be a gap. And that's why I emphasize that we really need to think about training and education for the next generation of farm workers. I've worked with Ed Taylor on a lot of these topics for many years, and he's often emphasized that Mexico actually has some great agricultural engineers that have a lot of really practical field skills. So we might be bringing farm workers still from Mexico, but who have a different skill set than we've traditionally seen in agriculture.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about, I don't hear things about the state there's a lot of talk right now about worker training programs, but I'm not hearing anything about that particular type of training, which seems like it might be an important omission.
Dan has a question.
Thank you for this presentation. I was interested in whether you've done any analysis on the impact of housing, the housing crisis on farm worker employment. You know, I imagine it has an impact on wages, but you know that is as well would make it, I think, an unattractive job for folks to enter this field if they can't find housing or if they have to share housing with many different families. And then the other question I would have is for the employers, to what extent is the risk of an IRCA sanction, given you know that perhaps some estimates say that about half of the farm worker population, the domestic worker population, is undocumented. Is that also driving employers to mechanization instead of employing farm workers?
Yeah, so well, I'll try my best to answer these questions. In terms of housing, I think there is limited research on this. I think it's really difficult to identify the impact of increasing housing prices. But some things that I think we see are increased use of farm labor contractors. We've had a major increase in farm labor contractors, particularly in California. So that could potentially be a solution in terms of workers could live relatively far from the fields where they actually work, and you could have a big bus of farm workers going to the fields. So we do see a lot of that. The other thing is increasing H2A employment. So a paper that I have with Marcelo Castillo, which is under review right now, we look at the effects of housing booms and busts on H2A employment, and we do find a positive effect of housing booms on H2A employment within the commuting zone. And one of the major mechanisms that we think at play here is increased competition for those workers with lower education that typically work on farms. So employment increases in construction, and a lot of competing industries and pulls workers from agriculture. Farm wages tend to rise, though there could be some additional mechanisms through housing prices. All employers of H2A have to provide housing for their workers. That's one of the provisions of H2A. And that's been a major challenge for some employers. And I don't know how common these stories are, but unfortunately, occasionally you see arson of new H2A housing that residents don't want seasonal agricultural workers living in their communities. So I think housing is a particularly challenging issue in this. The share unauthorized, as you mentioned, is about roughly 50% estimated according to the National Agricultural Workers Survey. In IRCA was passed, the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed in 1986, and that was the first time that it was illegal to knowingly hire unauthorized workers. So many people thought that that would actually reduce farm employment because there was so many unauthorized workers working in agriculture, but unauthorized workers just continued to come to agriculture because they actually found it difficult to enforce. So some of these more state and county level policies to enforce these immigration policies seem to have a negative impact on agricultural production, but nationally, I'm not aware of it having a really big impact. But I do think that is an important factor to take into consideration.
Great, thank you, Diane. That was a very nice presentation. Marianne.
Yes, so our next speaker is Reem Zayour. Reem is a graduate student here at UC Davis and works closely with Giovanni and some other students and faculty in the Global Migration Center. And she's going to be talking to us about undocumented workers in the US labor market during the COVID-19 crisis and post-DACA. Thanks so much, Reem, for sharing your research.
Yeah, thank you, Marianne. So can you all see my slides? Is it working? Okay. So thank you for all the organizers. And as Marianne just mentioned, I will be talking about undocumented immigrants in the US labor market during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I will shift gears a bit to talk about legalization policies and more specifically temporary legalization policies such as DACA. So to begin, I will give you a brief snapshot on undocumented immigrants in the US. And these are facts obtained using data from the CPS ASEC supplements for the years 2019 and 2020. So there are almost 10.2 million undocumented individuals in the US, and that is lower than the maximum that was reached in 2007, which was 12.2 million, but the number has been decreasing since then. So this population constitutes 30% of the foreign-born population and 4.4% of the employed working age population. And it constitutes relatively young individuals. So the average age of an undocumented immigrant is almost 40 years old. We can compare that to a documented immigrant, and their average age would be 49. And as for their education profile, most of them have low education levels. So 33.8% drop out of high school, 27.4% have only high school degrees. And this is a population that has no formal job access or access to welfare benefits or credit. They are excluded from safety net programs such as SNAP or Medicare. And for instance, during the pandemic, they were not also given federal stimulus checks. And although they are excluded from the formal job sector, they have a pretty high labor supply. So 68.8% of them were employed in 2019 and 2020. And if you look at males, the employment rate is 82.4%, and that is higher than the male employment rate for the natives and for the documented immigrants. And among those who are employed, almost 3 out of 4 work in sectors that were deemed essential during the pandemic. So these are sectors like childcare, agriculture, farming, food preparation. And these are mainly lower wage jobs. So if you look at the figure here, which shows the share of the undocumented workers in some essential occupations, we can see that in some of them, the share reaches 50%. So what this shows is that undocumented immigrants are basically clustered in lower wage jobs more than other immigrants and US-born workers. And research has shown that workers who work in such jobs are more vulnerable to economic crises or recessions or health crises. And that was apparent during the pandemic, because if we look at the employment and how it evolved during the pandemic, and here I have a figure from a report co-authored with Giovanni and the Center for American Progress, we see the using CPS monthly data, we see the employment rate difference from the value in December 2019 for the natives, the documented immigrants, and the undocumented immigrants. And if we look at the dark pink line, we can see that the undocumented population was among the first to start losing their jobs. And then they have a very sharp drop in April 2020. The difference is almost 16%, which is larger than the other differences for the other groups. But then at the same time as the economy was recovering, we see a very fast recovery. So the pace of recovering the jobs is faster than other groups, and the difference shrinks at a faster rate. Looking at the male employment rates, it's the same story. So here we can see that the male undocumented employment rate is pretty high before the pandemic, and then it sees a very sharp drop, and then a very fast recovery, although by December 2020, it was not back to its pre-pandemic levels. And the main story here is that there's an economic recession, although it is very short. These people are sharply and negatively affected, but at the same time, they have no access to the safety net. So they didn't have really any other option to stabilize their income streams, but to go back fast to jobs. Moving forward to the recovery. So as the economy was recovering from the COVID crisis and job creation was increasing, there were a lot of large labor shortages across industries. So in another report, also co-authored with Giovanni Peri, we look at the relationship or the correlation between the dependence on foreign-born workers before the pandemic and the rates of unfilled jobs in 2021. And we find this positive relationship, meaning that industries that relied on foreign-born workers before the pandemic are the industries that were seeing more unfilled jobs in 2021. And I know this is not very clear, but if we look at some industries such as food and accommodation, hospitality and leisure and services, these are industries that had a pretty high share of foreign-born, so these are like more than 20%. And at the same time, these are industries that had a very high rate of unfilled jobs, And these are the industries that felt the consequences of labor shortages. And if you remember from a couple of slides back, these industries also rely on undocumented workers. So they have a very high share of undocumented workers. So how can policy limit the negative effects of the pandemic on undocumented immigrants? Here we have a group that have a very high employment rate. They work in essential sectors. The sectors that they work in were seeing the labor shortages during the pandemic. And what can we do moving forward? There are probably many solutions to help enhance the well-being of undocumented immigrants, but I will be focusing only on immigration reform in my presentation. And immigration reform is not a new thing in the US. So there have been multiple attempts since the 1980s for immigration reform in a way to enhance the well-being of undocumented immigrants, but at the same time curbing illegal immigration. And the most notably is the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, which legalized almost 2.7 undocumented immigrants. And then in 2021, there were multiple proposals of legalization before Congress, but the progress was so slow and nothing has happened in this regard. But it is still very important to learn from previous reforms in order to see what works and how the benefits of reform take place. So that's why I will be focusing on the most recent executive action, which is the Deferred Action of Childhood Arrivals that passed in 2012. So as I mentioned, DACA was passed in 2012. It was passed by President Obama through an executive order. Almost 826,000 individuals have benefited from the policy since it has been passed. And there have been major benefits for DACA's recipients. These were given for 2 years and then were subject to renewal after 2 years. And these included work authorization and deferred action of removal. And it also gave recipients social security numbers, which gave undocumented individuals who got DACA access to loans and credit. But the main point here, or what is very important to note, is that this policy was only temporary. It did not give legal status or a pathway to citizenship, which makes it really very vulnerable to the risk of cancellation by future administrations, which was also very obvious during the Trump administration, which heavily challenged the program. So President Trump personally did not have a consistent view on DACA. At the beginning of his administration, he would refer to undocumented individuals who got DACA as absolutely incredible kids. He claimed that his administration will show great heart. But towards 2018, he was referring to them as far from angels and hardened criminals. But the situation facing the policy really climaxed in September 5th, 2017, and that's when the Trump administration suspended the program. After that, 15 states, including California, Washington, and New York, sued to block the recession, and federal court judges ordered the continuation of the program. And the end result was that individuals granted DACA before 2017 could keep its benefits and renew their status, but no new applications were considered. And in June 2020, the Supreme Court blocked DACA's repeal, saying it was unwarranted. But at the same time, the Supreme Court assured that future administrations could cancel the policy if only they do it in a legally proper manner. So here we can see more what was happening by looking at initial and renewal DACA applications. So if you look at the initial DACA applications, they reach a maximum in 2013. After that, they start decreasing. After Trump's suspension of the program, it's almost zero. However, if you look at renewal applications, after Trump suspends the program, people are still relatively renewing at a high rate. So what we can conclude here is that between 2012 and 2019, the risk of canceling the program and the uncertainty towards its permanency varied a lot. So that's why in my paper, I look at the effects of DACA between 2012 and 2019 on labor market and education outcomes. And I focus on whether varying expectations towards a temporary policy affect its benefits and its outcomes. And in order to answer this question, I utilize data from the American Community Survey between 2005 and 2019. Usually these surveys do not really ask about the legal status of individuals. And even if they do, we don't really expect undocumented individuals to just declare their status. So similar studies usually proxy for undocumented status using non-citizenship or Hispanic ethnicity, just because Hispanic individuals constitute a large proportion of undocumented immigrants. But instead of doing that, I utilize the residual method. And this residual method works by, first in the data, I identify for the foreign-born population, and then among this population, I identify likely legal individuals. These are individuals who satisfy all of these requirements. For instance, they arrived before 1980, they were citizens, they received social security benefits, born in Cuba, or have a legal immigrant spouse or citizen spouse. And then the remainder of this population is likely undocumented. And then I determine each individual's DACA eligibility. And the eligibility requirements included being undocumented, living in the US since 2012, arriving before the age of 16 and before 2007, and being under 31 years old as of June 2012, and having certain education requirements. And not to go into the technicalities, but what I do then is I compare eligible individuals to those who are not eligible before and after the passage of DACA. And in the after period, so after the passage of DACA, I split the period into two parts. One looks at the effects of DACA before the Trump administration challenged the program, and one looks at the effects of DACA after that, so after 2017. And we can see here that between 2012 and 2016, the effects of DACA were significant and positive on employment. So we have almost a 5.13 percentage point increase in the likelihood of working. And that is driven by an increase in the likelihood of participating in the labor force and a decrease in unemployment. Looking at education, there is a decrease in the likelihood of attending school. So there's a substitution that's happening here. But after 2017, the effects of DACA basically fade out. They're not significant anymore, except for the effect in education, which becomes larger in magnitude, more negative. And there might be multiple potential mechanisms that are driving the fading out of the effects of DACA, but in my paper, I argue that it is fear of deportation and uncertainty that's facing the program that is leading to these chilling effects. And I show that basically by utilizing Google search query data, and that is data that shows the search activity on Google. So I find Google search data for the terms DACA, DACA News Today, DACA Deportation, and DACA Trump News. And basically this is a relative index. So what happens here is that in the month where the search activity was maximum, it takes 100. In all other months, it is relative to that month. So we can see here that before September 2016, all the search activity is basically zero. And then in 2016, after Trump takes office, basically, it starts increasing. In September 2017, it spikes to reach 100, which is the maximum, and then it fluctuates after that. So what this basically shows is that when Trump was challenging the program, people were aware of what was happening, and that might have affected their perception of the permanency of the program and changed their fear of deportation and the risk of deportation. And then finally, I will show you some heterogeneity analysis, first by Hispanic ethnicity and then by political environments. And when I look at the effects of DACA by Hispanic ethnicity, I find that for the Hispanic group, they have larger effects than the non-Hispanic group between 2012 and 2016. But after 2017, the non-Hispanic group stops having any effects of DACA, but the Hispanic group still has positive and significant effects, although they are less in magnitude. They decreased in magnitude. And looking at the effects by political environment, I also do that just because, so we can think of states like California or democratic states, which provide a safety net for the undocumented individuals, while at the same time, you have states like Arizona or other Republican states that act to constrict them more. So by looking at the effects by political environments, and I specify whether a state was a Democratic state or a Republican state according to the 2016 election, I find that after DACA's passage, in Republican states, the effects of the policy are positive and significant, and they are relatively high in magnitude. But after 2017, although the effects of DACA are still there in Democratic states, they fade out in Republican states. So what this all says is that the benefits of DACA were not really equally experienced by those who were eligible. There are probably other factors that are institutional or network factors that were affecting who is benefiting from DACA and how much they are benefiting from DACA. So to conclude, the undocumented individuals showed how critical they are during the pandemic. They were running food supply chains, providing childcare, supporting medical systems, but at the same time, they were excluded from aid and recovery efforts, and that has made them more vulnerable to what was happening. So moving forward, because temporary policies can be volatile and susceptible to external factors, permanent legalization strategies might have more enduring effects on the employment of the undocumented and also on other outcomes like health and education of the undocumented. And in the same report that I just cited before, we stimulate basically the effects of different scenarios of legalization policies. And we find that by providing citizenship to the 10 million undocumented individuals, that would boost the US GDP by $1.7 trillion. And it would also create almost 439,000 jobs. And these jobs will not only be for the undocumented, it would also be for the natives and other immigrants. So it would basically be benefiting the whole economy. And yeah, that's my presentation for today. I am looking forward for your questions.
Thank you, Reem. Thank you for this nice overview on labor market and policies for undocumented. Let me emphasize that a lot of this research is very dear to the Global Migration Center, in the sense that we think that this issue of undocumented and not just the potential of legalization or regularization of them, but also policies that individual state can enact is going to affect a lot the economic success of this individual. There is, I think, by now very abundant evidence that other people in the panel have contributed to, that harsh enforcement has also negative economic labor market consequences. There is evidence that this chilling, meaning the undocumented becoming nervous, scared, and not going to work, not going to school, is also another impact of uncertainty in policy. And so I think that Reem provided a very good overview of how, on one hand, COVID made us aware of the crucial job that this group of people have, and on the other, of the vulnerability at which they are exposed, which certainly calls for some policy action. So sorry, this was just a comment and not so much a question. Open the floor to question, other comments, other thoughts about Reem's presentation. You can raise your hand or just unmute yourself.
Hi, Reem, it's Chloe. That was awesome. I really enjoyed the presentation. I may have missed it. So I have one question and then one more comment. So I may have missed it, but what age ranges are you looking at in the sample?
Yes, I actually did not go over that just for the sake of time, but
yeah,
it is there. So I restrict my sample to those who are between 18 and 30 and entered between the ages of 12 and 19. So basically I'm exploiting the age at migration, because 16 is the cutoff. So before 16, you're eligible. After that, you're not.
Got it. And so have you, just like a suggestion, I guess, then based on that is like to think about splitting by like pre and post college age as well, because I think some of the like previous work seems to suggest that that's important, and it might lead to different results on like people switching from being in school to being employed that might differ by the age of the individual.
Yeah, that's actually, so because my main focus was employment, I thought this would be the sample, But if we are looking at the effects of education and extending basically KUKA's and co-authors
Exactly.
papers,
Yeah.
that would be the way to do it. Yeah, it would be interesting to check if that also changed.
Great. Yeah, that sounds great. It sounds like you're already thinking about exactly what I'm thinking about. So, and then the comment was just about the heterogeneous analysis that you do. I think that's really interesting. And I just kind of like echo what Giovanni just said, that I think, and I'm going to mention this in my presentation too, like I think it's actually really important to think about not just the legal language surrounding the policies, but the just sort of general culture that we're in surrounding immigration. And so I'm like really appreciative that that's something that you're focusing on. I wonder if from the maybe not economics research, but other disciplines research, you might get a sense about what DACA recipients, like what their perceptions were in more immigrant friendly and less immigrant friendly states. If there were specific policies that states were implementing that might lead to the heterogeneity that you see, or if it's just a general feeling that people have that differs across states. I just think that would be really interesting to get a sense of what are the mechanisms driving those differences that you see.
Yeah, I actually have not, so in sociological research, I did see accounts of individuals through interviews when they say there's basically an attitude of fear, just because you don't want to give them your information again to renew, and then you're thinking maybe they're going to use that information in order to deport me later. But I haven't actually seen interviews where they specify, oh, it's California versus Arizona. Actually, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I think so too, just because it is a federal program. So I guess my prior was that there may be less heterogeneity since it is a federal program. So that would just be interesting to know.
Yeah, actually, I should look into that more. I agree, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks.
Dan.
Yes.
Thank you for this presentation. A couple questions about the impact of the volatility of DACA, what that has on certain student populations. I recall seeing some data at some point that most DACA students in California in higher education are in the community college system. And we saw a lot of students drop out during COVID. I wonder how much of this, the risk averse nature of participating in DACA coupled with the pandemic has had an impact on students who are saying, why bother continuing with higher education if I may not have status down the road, and with school itself being so difficult during COVID, whether that has led to students dropping out of higher education. That's one question. And the other is I guess, comments too. In terms of how the litigation impacted DACA with initial and renewal applications, having participated in the litigation, I found it very difficult to track the many court decisions on what populations would be eligible. Like injunctions were all over the place. Some allowed for initial applications and some did not. But most allowed for students the successful injunctions allow for renewals. So I can imagine that also having an impact on chilling effect, not knowing what the state of the law is based on the litigation. And then I am curious moving forward, what would be the impact of the fact that we have the DACA case at the Fifth Circuit going to the Supreme Court. That's an uphill battle. What kind of chilling effect is that having now on DACA recipients? And then on the heterogeneity question, I wonder, given that most DACA recipients are from Mexico, I also wonder if other national origin students were risk averse in participating in DACA if they came in with like a visa, for example, and their families overstayed and they became undocumented that way. Having entered with the visa kind of changes the dynamic of what kind of documents people have, passports, potentially even at one point getting driver's licenses before becoming undocumented. I wonder if that also has changed the nature of who is in the DACA program. So, but thank you again for this research and presentation.
Thank you for all the questions. Let me see if I can answer all of them. So the first question was DACA uncertainty versus COVID. I don't think there is research on that, and that would be really hard to test just because of the absence of the data. So even if you have data for 2020, just yesterday or the day before, the Census Bureau said that the Hispanic population was significantly undercounted in the ACS or the census. So I don't know how much we can do that. So yeah, it might be, so my research stops at 2019, but if we extend that to 2020 and what's happening with COVID, it might be that people are leaving just because their income is decreasing, they need to work to do that substitution. Or it might be that it's because, as you said, school is harder, or just because of DACA's uncertainty. So I really I don't think there's research on that, on how to isolate these from each other. As for the Supreme Court in the Supreme Court in 2020. So I also don't know how to answer that question 100%, just because, so yeah, the Supreme Court did say that they can, future administrations can cancel the program, but with the Biden administration, I think the attitude and the approach changed to, in general and specifically for DACA. So they resurrected the program in a way, and they restarted it. And but at the same time, yeah, because laws were changing so fast during the Trump administration, specifically after 2017, that is exactly what uncertainty. So that's what I mean by uncertainty. Yeah, and for the last question, it was about the nature of who is getting DACA. Can you repeat that question?
It was more about how, you know, it's very much mostly Mexican immigrants, and
Right.
I wonder if a lot of that has to do with how people entered, you know, other national origin populations perhaps entered with visas and overstayed, which I think creates a different set of opportunities for getting access to like driver's licenses or, you know, other documentation to
Yes, but DACA was only, so let me ask you this clarifying question so that to answer your question. So DACA was only available for those who entered at a very young age. So even if they came in with a visa, I don't think they could have had access to a lot of the things just because they were children when they entered. And that's what makes them eligible for DACA later on. But I agree that their parents might have had access to other things that would have affected their outcomes. So yeah, that would be interesting to look at the basically the difference or the heterogeneity in the parent circumstances on the children, and that's actually something that I haven't seen before.
Great, thank you. I think we are on track, and we can, unless there are other questions, we can move to the next speaker.
Actually, we are scheduled for a break in 2 minutes,
yeah,
but
right.
if nobody else has a question, I'm going to ask one, which is
Yeah.
a really minor one. But since I'm not an expert in this area by any means, the part of your presentation that impressed me the most, which I was unaware of, is that there is this stronger bouncing back in terms of labor force participation among undocumented immigrants than amongst other groups, such as natives. I thought that was super interesting. And then I think it's your next chart, actually. So then you made the point that these workers are disproportionately in the job areas that are experiencing the biggest labor shortages. So we really need these workers. That's your point, right? I think it'd be really nice to actually, if you can show this, to actually show some, it's sort of almost as an advocacy, almost as a point of making an advocacy point, to show actually what fraction of workers in each of these categories you think are undocumented versus not, to sort of make the case, as politically so many groups now are sort of making complaints about not that I agree with these complaints, but about how Americans are not willing to go back to work, that and again, I'm not suggesting I'm on that side of the political argument in the way that it's being made, but just sort of guess what? Disproportionately, these jobs are being filled by undocumented workers who are often kind of experiencing particular discrimination in the labor market. I'm not sure if I made that point, but just showing the fractions and how the fractions have evolved over time for the undocumented workers versus the other groups within these areas where there are labor shortages, I think would be super interesting for making that point.
Yeah, I agree. So here we focus on the foreign-born just because in the report, we also focus on the shortfall of the foreign-born individuals during the pandemic. But yeah, if we check the share of undocumented immigrants in the food industry, for instance, it's gonna be a very high share.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Both, and probably a higher share now
Right.
than it was before. And so I don't know. I think that statistic could be used in ways to make a really important point, I think, for these arguments about, you know, why aren't people working now? Well, some people are, some people are, right? So anyway, yeah, we are scheduled for a break right now, and we will come back at 10:15.
Okay, break.
Should we get started again? Chloe, do you feel ready? Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll share.
Great. So without further ado, this is Chloe East. Chloe East is a former graduate student from UC Davis who is now at University of Colorado, Denver. And she is an expert on both immigration and on the safety net, which is what she's going to be talking about today. So thanks very much, Chloe.
Yeah, thank you, Marianne and Giovanni. This is great. I'm really enjoying the presentations and excited to tell you a little bit more about this topic, which I've been working on for a long time. I thought I would start by just saying that if you want more citations or more detailed information on what I'm presenting, a lot of what I'm presenting is based on the Con-Effect memo that I wrote at the beginning of the pandemic with Hillary Hoynes and Tara Watson about immigrants' access to the safety net and how they're being disproportionately harmed and less well protected during COVID-19. So point you to that for more details. Okay, so I want to start out by just saying kind of broadly, I think one of the things that has come out of the pandemic, at least from my perspective, given what I focus on, is a renewed interest in understanding the gaps that exist in our safety net and trying to fill those in. And I think that one of the gaps that has been revealed and that has gotten a lot of attention, which I do think is great, is the fact that immigrants are excluded from many of our key safety net programs in the US. And so just to give a little bit of background on this, for those who aren't aware, prior to welfare reform in 1996 under Clinton, there was not a lot of difference in eligibility between citizens and non-citizens for major safety net programs in the US, including SNAP, Medicaid, WIC, TANF, and other programs. But as part of welfare reform, many non-citizens were made ineligible for these programs. Some were made ineligible for permanently, and some are eligible after they have lived in the US for 5 years. And I do want to clarify that what I'm talking about here are authorized non-citizens. Unauthorized non-citizens have never been eligible for these programs, at least at the federal level. So as a result of this big policy shift in 1996, we now have this kind of gap in access to the safety net between non-citizens and citizens. And I will note, especially since this is a California-focused event, that some states are more generous. They use their own money to restore benefits to non-citizens who are not eligible federally for these programs. And of course, California is one of them. As I'll talk about later, California is often kind of a leader in terms of these types of immigrant-friendly safety net policies. So that's kind of the statutory situation that we're in right now, in the sense that there is this like legal eligibility limit for non-citizens for safety net programs. But I want to talk about two other not legal restrictions, but practical restrictions that make immigrants able to access the safety net less easily, less often than US born. So the first is there are many programs, including unemployment insurance, which I'll focus on here since that was such a big and important program during the pandemic, that do not explicitly bar immigrants from participating. So as long as you're authorized to work in the US, you're eligible for UI. But UI is not a universal program, and there are many industries and occupations that are not covered by unemployment insurance, and individuals have to meet minimum earnings and work history requirements in order to be eligible for UI. And so practically, because of the types of work that many immigrants do, they're excluded from receiving UI benefits. And so even though it's not an actual non-citizens are not eligible rule, it ends up discriminating against non-citizens in terms of who's eligible for UI. And then finally, I want to know what came up in the prior talk, which is this idea that it doesn't even need to be specific legal actions against immigrants, barring immigrants from participating from the programs in order for us to see decreases in participation in these safety net programs among immigrants. So we see basically that as sort of a proxy for immigrant status, there's a much lower participation rate in programs like SNAP among Hispanics than there is among other groups, even among those who are eligible. And the reason that people, or one of the reasons that people think that participation is lower among immigrant groups, even among those who are eligible, is because of this idea of chilling effects. And so that in the safety net context, people typically think about either other anti-immigrant policies like enforcement policy or anti-immigrant rhetoric, including the public charge rule that was announced under Trump. Even though those things are not actually changing eligibility for immigrants in the safety net programs, they're still reducing participation because of this fear effect. And I think that that's really important to take account of when we're thinking about access to the safety net for this group. It's not really just the laws, it's also the kind of cultural context that we're in that affects access. Okay, so this graph I'm showing you, it just kind of gives you a sense in numbers what I was just talking about in words, which is I'm plotting for citizens in blue and non-citizens in orange, the participation rates pre-COVID. So this is in 2018. So this is participation rates in unemployment insurance among those who are unemployed on the far left, SNAP among low-income households in the middle, and then SNAP among low-income households with kids on the far right. And so the basic point that I want to illustrate here is that there is this big gap even before COVID in terms of safety net receipt between households with citizens and households with non-citizens. And so I don't think I need to totally convince everybody in this audience why this is worrisome, but I'll go ahead and say it. So in 2017, there were an estimated 25 million non-citizens. As Reem was saying, it's about 10.3 million estimated to be unauthorized now. It was a little higher before the pandemic. And 11 million citizen kids, so these are US citizen kids, have a non-citizen parent right now. And 5 million, again, US citizen kids have an unauthorized parent. So there's a large population of children who are impacted by having non-citizen and unauthorized parents. And just to kind of illustrate this, the figure on the right is showing you the poverty rate among US kids who live with an unauthorized parent, and it's 34%, which is double the national child poverty rate. And I checked this, and this is the same for California, actually, that the numbers are identical. And so I think this is actually, I'll just mention, this comes from work that I'm doing with the Children's Thrive Action Network, which is an advocacy organization for kids living in immigrant families. And so the kind of point that I'm trying to illustrate here is that there are a lot of US citizen kids and kids in general who are living in non-citizen mixed status households and who are as a result living in poverty and low-income households. So I also want to highlight that we know from prior research that access to the safety net for kids improves their health while they're kids, and when they grow up and become adults, it improves their health and economic outcomes as well. And this is true for immigrants specifically, but also kids in general. Okay, so Reem already kind of highlighted this, but I'll just quickly mention that sort of in addition to immigrants being less well protected by the safety net prior to COVID, we also see that immigrants were disproportionately affected economically during COVID. So this graph here is kind of analogous to what I just showed you, citizens in the blue, non-citizens in the green, and you just see that the change in labor market outcomes from February to April 2020 is larger for non-citizens across all measures. So we see bigger decreases in employment, bigger increases in not in the labor force and unemployment. And as was highlighted in the previous presentation, this is in part because of the occupation and industries that non-citizens work in. And then I will say that I just pulled the numbers, the most current numbers that I could find from January 2022. And non-citizens still are at a 4% unemployment rate, which is double the unemployment rate that they had in April 2019, compared to a 3% unemployment rate currently for citizens. So basically just trying to illustrate that not only was the immediate shock of the pandemic disproportionately large for immigrants, but there still seems to be a persistently negative economic impact on immigrants. And then this figure I've taken from the Urban Institute, and I want to just kind of translate the employment outcomes that I showed you on the previous slide into actual economic hardship at the household level. So this is in the initial 2 months of the pandemic. This is a survey that the Urban Institute did, where they looked at, or they asked households whether or not they were experiencing different types of material hardship. So if they're having trouble paying bills, if they were food insecure, they were having trouble getting needed medical care, et cetera. And so again, same idea with this plot. The non-citizens are, all non-citizens in the family is in blue, and family members with all citizens is in yellow here. And so if you just go to the far left, you can see that the rates of material hardship in the first couple months of the pandemic were, first of all, just very high. I mean, in levels, these are extremely high rates of material hardship, but they're also just, higher for households that have non-citizens in them. And this is true across all the different measures of material hardship going to the right. Okay, so then I will show you the version of the graph that I had before, but now this is using data that covers the pandemic period. So this is safety net participation in 2020 from the current population survey, but otherwise the graph is the same. So I think, again, a couple of things to note here. You see that for UI in particular, there's this big jump up for both groups. The levels have gone up quite a bit, and I actually didn't know that the rate of participation of UI among citizens was 50%. That's basically what this graph is showing in 2020, which is pretty shocking to me, especially since this is likely an undercount. But we still see that gap, basically. So even though UI has increased for both populations, we still see that non-citizens, even among the unemployed, are less likely to receive UI. And then interestingly, the increase in SNAP is smaller, but this is conditioning on a low income sample. So and we know that SNAP increased overall during the pandemic, and basically what happened is more people shifted into this low income eligible group. So there's an increase in SNAP overall, but among those who are eligible, there's not that big of a change in participation. And again, you see this gap between citizens and non-citizens during the pandemic. Okay, so I will, so I will talk a little bit about sort of what the policy response was, focusing specifically on programs that non-citizens were either eligible for or not eligible for, and then make some sort of suggestions for going forward. So to start, many of the major recovery packages that were passed in the early days of the pandemic excluded big groups of immigrants. In particular, the CARES Act, which had the big economic stimulus payments, excluded individuals who lived in a household or filed a tax form where their spouse didn't have a social security number, or they had a dependent who didn't have a social security number. So even if the tax filer had a social security number, if they're in this kind of like mixed status, mixed SSN household, they were not eligible for these stimulus payments. Similarly, the SNAP increases that we saw in the first couple months of the pandemic only were available to authorized immigrants and only were available to them after 5 years of residence in the US. So those are big groups that were excluded from these payments early on in the pandemic. One thing that did happen, which is what this table is illustrating, is that the stimulus that was passed in December 2020 did attempt to kind of rectify some of these gaps. And so you can see basically that individuals who filed taxes where their spouse didn't have a social security number were now eligible for new stimulus payments. So that's the additional 1.4 million in the middle there. And then some individuals with kids or dependents who didn't have a social security number were also eligible for the new round of stimulus payments. So that's another 1.5 million individuals who were included in the December package that weren't included in the earlier one. So I think basically all of these recovery efforts really highlighted that there is this gap in access between immigrants and natives. And we saw that, I think, very clearly in these different recovery efforts. Okay, so moving towards a slightly more positive note, I will say that some states, including California, like I mentioned at the top, stepped in really early on in the pandemic and worked to create their own recovery efforts that targeted immigrants who would be left out of the federal recovery efforts. So specifically, California created this $125 million fund that unauthorized immigrants were eligible for, and the amount differed by their household size. And I think that these kinds of patchwork changes are hugely important for the lives of immigrant workers and their families. I think at this point we have a lot of research showing that when states do pass these kinds of kind of fill-in programs for the safety net, that it has really large benefits for immigrant families. But I want to kind of think about two other kind of approaches or things to think about going forward besides just these state programs. So I think that one is that we can kind of change how we think about the language and about why immigrants should be included in the safety net. And I would argue that they should be included in the safety net. I think making the safety net more inclusive is going to be good for a number of reasons. As the previous talk emphasized, obviously immigrants are crucial for our economy, and so supporting these workers is really important. The work that we have on children and the benefits of the safety net for kids makes it really clear that providing safety net benefits for immigrant families is an investment in the future. And I think one thing that's been particularly highlighted during the pandemic is that when we exclude some smaller or not smaller groups from the safety net, not only does it harm those groups, but it harms groups that they interact with. And that's something that we've really, I think, seen from a public health standpoint in the pandemic that maybe wasn't totally obvious before. And then finally, I'll just highlight that as I mentioned before, I'm doing some work with the Children's Thrive Action Network. And one of the things that we've really been talking about a lot is working within the current policy landscape that we have right now to encourage eligible immigrants to participate in safety net programs that they are not currently participating in. So really targeting that chilling effect that I mentioned up top. I think that there's actually a lot of room for positive improvements, even without policy changes, but with rhetoric changes and information changes. And so that's something that I'm hopeful about going forward. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. Let me open up to question. I see that Marianne has a question in the chat. I don't know, do you want to ask Marianne that question in person, or maybe that and some other?
Sure, I'm happy to, although I think there might, well, yeah. So I just was interested in one of the early slides you were showing about the fraction of kids in undocumented families who counted as poor. Is that the official poverty rate? So we probably should assume that since they are less likely to be eligible for safety net programs, and in California housing costs are so high, that this could be much higher in California than 34%.
Yes.
Is that the right way to think about it?
Yes, I think that's right.
That's pretty. It was an impressive number anyway. Now it's really impressive.
Other questions? So, Chloe, I have a question. So the question is the following. You advocate for the inclusion of immigrants in the safety net in a more systematic way, in a more, and what we know from the US is that immigrants, as you have shown in many cases, don't have much less access to the safety net. However, many of them, particularly many of the undocumented, the low educated, have actually very high employment rates relative to, let me just take to many European countries where immigrants, especially some particular group of immigrant refugees, maybe is the prominent example, they have much more access to some form of support, safety net, but they have very low employment rate. So number one is, do you think there is a little bit of a trade-off here? And so more access to safety net will come with better income for them, which is great. And then and many other measures. Will it cost, in your view, or from what you know, some of the employment rate? And the second question is, how would you compare the effectiveness of safety net to the effectiveness of a policy instead that will hit the labor market much more directly, such as minimum wage, an increase in minimum wage for everybody? And given that a lot of immigrants are going to be in that area of minimum wage, this would seem to be almost an anti-poverty measure also for a large chunk of immigrants. And it wouldn't generate the question, and which is who is eligible, who's not. Everybody qualifies. Give me a little bit of your perspective between these two types of policies.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the question when we're thinking about safety net programs is always going to be the cost of discouraging work balanced with the benefits of investing in kids and investing in families. And, if we're thinking about other safety net programs, it can be other benefits, but I guess if we're focused on families, then that's what I would say. And I do think, my own work shows that when immigrants are given access to food stamps in particular, is what my work is on, there are really big benefits in terms of improved children's health outcomes, but there are costs in the sense that married men and single women work less as a result. And so I do think that, I don't think that there are no costs. I guess that's not what I'm trying to say. But I do think that, to me, it seems clear that there are a lot of benefits, and I suppose we can weigh the benefits and the costs, but I also am, I think, less, I don't know, in particular, when I'm thinking about kids, I'm less convinced that maximizing the work of parents is the welfare maximizing outcome. And so I think that that's something that we should keep in mind, in particular, when we're thinking about children and immigrant families.
Definitely. Yes, definitely. In fact, I was, many times us economists take employment rate as a very important statistics, but as you say, sometimes comes at the cost of many other things, and also is something that we don't need to maximize that. We need to maximize the well-being of the families.
Exactly.
So that's a very good point. Yes.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments for Chloe?
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, sorry. Ooh,
Yeah.
I'm gonna give that word. Yeah, you have time. Saxi, please take ask the question.
Hey, Chloe. I just wrote my question in the chat box. As you said that, non-citizens are eligible to claim the UI benefit. However, I have seen, that many non-citizens have a work visa, which is tied to their employer. So if they are laid off, they do not meet requirement of, I'm available to work and search a job. So that's the reason they are not eligible to claim the UI.
I see. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. So basically, some individuals are only authorized to work for one employer. So when they no longer work for that one employer, they're not eligible to remain in the US or receive UI.
Yeah, and that's the case with H-1B visa, I guess. So that is,
so I guess I would just, that's a great point. And I think I would just add that to the other reasons that I already stated, which is, I think there are lots of reasons that non-citizens have less access, and you're bringing up a really good point of another one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any more questions? Okay.
Yep.
Should we move on to Jacob Hibble? Jacob Hibble is a professor of sociology here at UC Davis. He is a faculty affiliate at the Global Migration Center, and he is the deputy director of the Center for Poverty and Inequality Research. He is also an expert on sociology of education with a particular expertise on disadvantaged children. Take it away, Jacob.
Thanks very much, Marianne. Everything looking okay in terms of screen sharing and stuff? Okay, great. So thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this panel. It's just a really cool idea for an event, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing our panelists' comments later on. The presentations have been outstanding so far. So this talk that I'll give today is very much a team effort. So I just want to start off by acknowledging, so my name and Sean Arceo's name are on the title slide. We're sort of, I guess, co-leads on this project. Dr. Arceo is a research manager at Pivot Learning and Education Consultant group in Oakland, and is an alumnus of our PhD program in sociology. But everything I'll present today is work that was done by a group of researchers who are members of the California Public Education Policy Analysis Lab, CalPeople. It's a research group focusing on K through 12 education policy in California, particularly the consequences of policy and practice for social and academic equality. And so this team includes, just in alphabetical order here, Ji-Young Ban, Lucas Fowler, Lindsay Maurer, Shreyan Mohanty, Angelita Repetto, and Preetha Valayapan. This is a really great group of graduate students, undergraduate students from a number of different disciplines here at UC Davis, and it's been great fun to work with this team. Most of our work to date has focused on the local factors associated with school district level variation in spending, as well as the academic priorities that school districts set for themselves in consultation with members of their communities. But this event gave us the opportunity to do a new analysis to examine some brand new data to provide what I think is sort of an early look at where California public education supports for immigrant students seem to be headed following what was, of course, a massive disruption to schooling caused by COVID-19. So in this talk, we'll go through a little bit, probably I'll go quickly through the overview of California's children and immigrant families. This is a pretty savvy audience here. I want to talk a bit about what the education policy landscape currently looks like in California. It's very, very interesting. And then we'll get into some of our initial findings, breaking this policy down into the pre-COVID era of school district funding and priority setting and policy making. Then seeing what happened during that remote schooling year in 2020 and 2021, when the whole public education system more or less shut down and moved to a remote format, and then where things are now headed during this return to in-person schooling. All right, so research on inequality, social stratification, immigrant incorporation often focuses on schooling as a key piece of the intergenerational status transmission process. Immigrant students, by which I mean students who were themselves born abroad or those whose parents did, so first or second generation immigrants, are of course, very large and diverse segment of the California student population. Nearly half of the school-age population live in immigrant families in our state. If we examine variation in public schools' approaches to supporting immigrant students, we will learn a whole lot about the roots of and potential solutions to longstanding social inequalities in California. And the trend, of course, for many decades now is that what happens in California in one decade is what ends up happening a couple decades later through the rest of the country, especially with respect to education. California is sort of at the vanguard in many ways. So to the extent that our public schools recognize the distinct barriers to equal education opportunity that many immigrant students confront, as well as the fact that, as sort of the graphs here indicate, that immigrant students, families, and communities are not homogeneous groups. There's not one thing that is like an immigrant population in California or really anywhere else. To the extent that these differences and these needs are recognized, schooling institutions might be especially effective points of support and intervention and engines of social mobility. This is especially true when public school policies and programs and practices can be responsive to locally distinct needs at the community level. And it so happens that that is the direction that California education policy has been heading since 2013, when the local control funding formula was introduced. So this was a major reform to California's education finance system that then Governor Jerry Brown ushered in 2013. Prior to that, historically, California's education finance system, like most public education finance systems, was based largely on local residential and commercial property taxes. California is a very unequal state geographically. This led to very unequal funding levels across school districts. And in addition to this reliance on local taxes, the state public school finance system was comprised of this very convoluted, in many ways opaque and very unequal system of categorical allocations that led to school districts that on paper looked very similar, had similar needs, receiving very different amounts of funding. Today, approximately 60% of California public school funding comes from state sources through the local control funding formula. 33% comes from local sources like taxes and local bonds and so forth. And it's something like 8% of funding comes from federal sources, and most of that is for special programming like special education. Okay. I should have been clicking through all this time. Okay, so as its name suggests, the local control funding formula emphasizes local control. And as I mentioned previously, this has the potential to be an especially effective way to tailor public education systems to the communities that they serve. To the extent that there are relatively high concentrations of immigrant families in a particular school district, they have the potential through this system, in theory, to have a say in what public schools do, how they conduct schooling, what their goals are, what the accountability targets that they're aiming for look like, and so forth. So the local control funding formula, one of the major changes it made was to emphasize this input from local stakeholders. This includes parents of students, but also anyone in the community. Many local school districts have open forums where sort of local business leaders or nonprofit groups or community-based organizations can sort of organize in many cases to influence what public education looks like in their school district. My co-author, Sean Arceo, wrote a really excellent dissertation looking at this process, the community stakeholder engagement, and how community-based organizations were shaping public schooling. Another hallmark of LCFF is that it focuses on 3 student groups in particular that the California legislature defined as high needs student groups, and requires school districts to come up with specific plans for increasing equity with respect to members of these populations. Low-income students, foster youth, and English learners, English learning students, are the high-need populations. Other populations that we might consider to be high-need populations are not, right? So there are three groups that this policy focuses on. What this means is that for every student who is enrolled in a school district who's a member of one of these populations, the school district receives additional funding, an additional 20% of the sort of regular amount per pupil funding that a district would get for every member of one of these groups. Unless there are more than 55% of students in the district who belong to these groups, then there's an additional funding amount, 1.5 times the base allocation that districts receive for every student who's a member of one of these populations. These groups are taken together. The law as it's written refers to them as unduplicated pupils, because the way they count them up is a student is, once they're a member of one group, they can't be counted twice, right? So if you were a low-income student and a foster youth, you don't count twice, you only count once. So they use this term unduplicated pupils. It's a phrase that didn't exist, wasn't in use before LCFF, but it has now entered the lexicon. It's now part of California education parlance. We'll actually see this as if I ever get to the data analysis portion. Okay, so the centerpiece of the local control funding formula is a policy document called the Local Control and Accountability Plan. Every year, every school district has to produce one of these documents. It's a policy document that includes detailed plans for what their goals are. And again, these goals are intended to be informed by members of the local community, how they're going to allocate their funding in ways to achieve that will help them achieve those goals, a review of what their goals were in the prior year, whether they met them or not, what they're going to do to meet the goals they didn't meet, and so forth. And then at the end of the LCAP, the last section, there's a specific focus on equity. Like what are the steps the district is going to take to improve outcomes for members of these unduplicated pupil populations specifically. So the LCAPs are the focus of our analysis. We do content analysis of these policies in various ways. During I have to stop myself from calling it the pandemic year, or referring to last year as during the pandemic. Clearly, we're still in the midst of the pandemic. The 2020 and 2021 version, the remote schooling year version, was called, if you look at the words, Learning Continuity and Attendance Plan. It also goes LCAP, but they call it LCP. Shame they didn't come up with something a little bit more different. But the LCP is sort of the remote schooling year analog to the LCAP. We are going to examine these documents to answer today just some very descriptive questions. Members of our team have used these documents to do much more sort of sophisticated inferential kinds of analyses. Dr. Arceo's dissertation is a great example where he did this sort of structural topic modeling using computational text analysis methods to identify themes and topics that emerged across school districts. Here, we're just going to answer some basic questions. How and in what terms did school districts discuss the needs of immigrant youth in their in their LCAP's equity plans? This last section of the LCAP, where districts explicitly have to say, what are we going to do to increase equity among our students? We're going to look at these 3 time periods: the pre-pandemic years, the year of remote schooling, and then the current academic year. So as schooling has returned to an in-person format. Really, what we want to know is what happened when schooling went remote. Were the trends that we were seeing in the ways school districts were talking about immigrant students and immigrant families disrupted when schooling was disrupted? Did something change about the way educators and education administrators viewed their goals and the most important tasks? And then to the extent those things were disrupted, what happened now? When we returned to in-person schooling, did school districts resume the trends that were previously in place? Have we returned to the sort of, I would call it progress, but the direction that policy and programming was headed? Or did the pandemic usher in a new status quo and is now the purpose of schooling viewed differently by school districts? So again, our data come from what is a nearly comprehensive collection of LCAPs that we have been collecting dating back to the first year of LCFF, from the 2014-15 school year up through 2019-20. Then we have all the LCPs, that pandemic year version of the document, from the 2021-22 year. And then we've been collecting this year's documents as they've been released. And we have a relatively high share of all the school districts' LCAPs by this point in the school year. And what we're doing is taking the text from this last section of the document where the districts articulate their increased or improved services as language, like what are they going to do? How are they going to add more value? How are they going to boost the learning of students from these high need populations? This total corpus of data amounts to about well over 6,000 documents. The documents themselves are PDF files that range from 40 pages or so up through several hundred pages long. The documents are in PDF format, which has been challenging to use, and it might be why our lab seems to be the only large-scale effort to examine these policy data. Another complication is the policy has been in place for 8 years, and we're already on our 4th template for these documents. So automating the text extraction and analysis process has been a fun opportunity to learn new computational skills. We link these data with several other administrative data sources and sort of demographic data sources from the Census Bureau, as well as the California Department of Education. Regional data on school districts comes from the California County Superintendent's Educational Services Association, just pronounce that CESA. The analyses I'll show you today are, like I said, fairly descriptive. We take a text processing approach referred to as bag of words, very descriptive. It's just we extract all of the text we can from these documents and then analyze the prevalence of key terms that are identified with particular populations of students. I think I didn't mention this. The LCP data, the pandemic year data, were provided by another research group here on campus at UC Davis, the California Education Lab. It's a group of researchers that many of us work closely with. The director, Sherry Reed, there was very kind to share their data. Okay, so here's an image of what part of the LCAP that we're analyzing looks like. It's this increased and improved services for unduplicated pupils. Remember, unduplicated pupils are these high need students, of which English learners are one of the groups. And we'll see English learners become an important group. It lists the amount of extra funding. This is the extra funding school district, this particular school district, Redwood City Elementary District, received based on their concentration of students from these high need populations. This 14% is the relative increase in total funding they got as a result of this supplemental and concentration grant process. And then they need to articulate how they're going to increase services by that same amount. It's a very interesting idea, seemingly very rational and logical, that if you get 14% more funding, you have to increase services by that same amount. And what we do is then take the description of all of these services, the students that are being served, and we process the text in ways that looks for key terms. So here's an example. Newcomer is another one of these sort of education jargon terms that has been introduced. Technically, newcomer refers to students whose families immigrated or came from another country to the United States within the last 3 years. So it's a very specific population technically, but when you observe the use of this term newcomer over time by educators in California anyway, you see it kind of becomes a euphemism for immigrant. Okay, let's start right off with like the major finding that needs to sort of get out of the way, which is here, these are word prevalences, the frequency that these LCAP documents used particular words listed up at the top by year across our data set. And like, like Grover said on Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the others. English learner, you can see like dwarfs any of the other terms. In general, this is not just a California thing, but in education overall in the United States, English learners become sort of the catch-all category, the main focus. Whenever, oftentimes when educators or policymakers want to talk about immigrant students, they talk about English learners instead. Now, at any given time, about 20% of California students are English learners. At the same time, about 50% of students in California live in immigrant families. These are not interchangeable ideas, but educators and policymakers tend to reduce the needs of immigrant students down to English fluency, substituting English learner for immigrant. So this is a critique I'm making, saying that English fluency is important, but it's far from the only factor that influence immigrant youth's social, cultural, economic incorporation, all these things that schooling might be able to address. But perhaps because language instruction is a more traditional or familiar practice for educators, it receives the overwhelming focus. Okay, with that critique being made, it's clear that English learners do have very specific needs that have not been met very well in public schools in the United States, particularly in California, somewhat surprisingly. Like gaps between English learners and non-English learners when it comes to achievement or high school graduation, educational attainment are wider in California than in many other states. This was exacerbated during the COVID pandemic. I think Dan Torres earlier mentioned student attrition at the post-secondary level. At the K-12 level, there's been a huge loss of students from English learner families. School districts can't find them. But in addition, they were just not getting the supports that they are entitled to when it comes to instructional supports. Remote learning seems to have not worked very well for English learner students. If you look at it, achievement test scores, taking into account their relative drawbacks and merits, of course, English learners on average lost 3.8 months of learning in English language arts and 3.1 months of learning in math over the course of the pandemic year, compared to 2.3 months, or about 2.3 months for all other students. So English learners were certainly hit harder by schooling during the pandemic. This is more, I'm taking longer than I wanted to. This figure illustrates the fact that at the beginning of LCFF, when the first LCAPs were produced by school districts, they tended to discuss the three populations that make up unduplicated pupils at relatively even levels: English learners, low-income students, foster youth. Over time, English learners became a sort of predominant group. Districts discussed English learners more than other populations. Again, perhaps because it's not as clear to educators how to quote unquote fix the issues associated with being a foster youth or being a low-income student. Whereas if the problem is that a student doesn't know English very well, educators know what to do, and they can easily say, they can point to commercially available curricula and say, we're going to spend our money buying these English development curricula, and that's going to increase equality. Here, this graph also illustrates the way these terms, unduplicated pupil and unduplicated student, started out being evident in a minority of school districts, then over time became used increasingly frequently. This figure only shows the pre-pandemic period. Here we see during the remote schooling year, a big drop off in school districts' attention paid to unduplicated pupils per se. The way that the policy asks districts to report on their services for students broke out these populations. So it's perhaps unsurprising that school districts dropped that term in many ways from their policies, but then this year it's kind of bounced right back. We're back to talking about a catch-all category of like high need student in general. Here, this figure, I separate out frequency of terms related to linguistic status on the left. Again, you see this big drop off during the pandemic year in specific terms that are used to describe English learners, those who are sort of developing English fluency, those who have been reclassified as English proficient, those who are long-term English learners. Those sort of specific terms dropped way off as school districts kind of frantically try to come up with plans that they could just administer to all English learners in the district, is one interpretation. But then now this year, those terms have rebounded and are back to resuming the trend they were on. On the right, the question that we were more interested in is districts' discussion of immigrant students per se. Here, using terms like newcomer, migrant, immigrant, refugee, there was a trend over time and increasing use of these terms, even though they're not explicitly directed to describe services for these students. Districts over time had this increasing trend of articulating plans for specific student populations. With respect to newcomers, again, the term that is sort of in vogue among education circles for describing immigrant populations, that dropped off during the pandemic, but in this year has again rebounded and kind of resumed the trajectory it was on. This happened with other student populations as well. Districts were not mandated to discuss. The figure down here shows the use of African American as a term to describe students who might need specific or special services. That was on an upward trend over time, dropped way off during the pandemic, same thing for Native American students, but both of those have rebounded this year. Somewhat less evidence that the same process happened for students with disabilities.
Jacob, you are a little over time, actually.
Okay. Let's do this part. Let's do the last thing. Here's what we found. During the pre-COVID period, districts overwhelmingly focused on English learners, although growth and discussion of immigrant students per se was increasing over time. During the pandemic, districts narrowed their focus to just what the state was asking them to do, but they didn't maintain this kind of narrowed down focus in the post-pandemic period, or this year rather. We're kind of back to resuming the pre-COVID trajectories, which includes more diverse emphases or inclusion of, I guess, a broader set of student populations. I apologize for going over time.
Thank you, Jacob, for a very interesting presentation and little new techniques here that we have seen. Questions from the panel, from the audience. Anyway.
I do have a question. Thank you, Jacob, for that presentation. To your point about immigrant students dropping out, can you speak more about that? And are you seeing now that we're hopefully getting out of the pandemic, a change? Are there new are students re-enrolling? Is there more contact with families? And what's the direction that you're seeing?
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of regional variation in this. So there are like pockets of the state in Southern California, in LA and in San Diego, those areas, for example, where there's like a third of students in some school districts that were enrolled prior to 2020 and 2021 that are now no longer enrolled or not coming to school. And administrators, educators are having trouble finding them. Those students are disproportionately concentrated in immigrant families and low-income families. And there has been a trend of decreasing enrollments in schools in California, but there was like a shock to this caused by the remote schooling year, or that coincided with the schooling year. And that's a case where we did not resume. We haven't like bounced right back. There's a bunch of students who are just kind of vanished or gone. It's very worrisome.
And I think related to this, we saw a huge, again, gap in digital equity with immigrant students during COVID. Are you seeing a new sort of paradigm there that emerging?
Yeah, I think that goes on to the sort of next steps slide. So what happened was during the remote schooling year, generally what school districts did was say we bought an online English language development curriculum, and we're going to make that available to students via PowerPoint slides and via Zoom. They just sort of said they were going to do that. And it doesn't seem to have been very effective. Surveys of parents of English learners say there's like 45% of those parents said that their students were not being supported, didn't have what they needed. And even lower share of teachers said that they were able to give students what they needed. So what we want to do next is now look, now that we're back in person, are schools still relying on this kind of buying an online curriculum and saying this is how we're meeting the needs of students, or have they abandoned that approach? Was that just like a stopgap sort of thing? It's an open question, but an important one.
Can I ask a follow-on question to that with respect to the issue of the increases in absenteeism amongst the English language learners? Are you planning to sort of relate that to different districts' approaches? Like, as we come out of this, it would be really interesting to know if the districts in which we get more of a bounce back in terms of absenteeism are districts that used their funds in very particular ways. Is that kind of part of what you're planning on doing in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so these data are like very well suited for that. So we can identify pieces of the policy documents where they're talking about English learners, the services they're going to provide, and then you basically look at the words surrounding that term and look for words like attendance or attrition. And then from there, you can identify what the specific practices are that districts are using. So one thing, for example, you could do is say, have districts been linking English learners and attendance as part of their discussion of issues they want to address over time? Like, has that been increasing? Was there a big jump in that post-pandemic? And then I gotta stop saying post-pandemic, post-remote schooling. And then how are districts planning to fix this problem? There isn't a best practice, to my knowledge. There isn't like consensus on how to solve this problem of a vanished population of students. But it's something it's something we intend to examine.
So you'll continue to be following these students for several more years, essentially.
Yeah, we want to just follow. We want to keep collecting these documents forever, basically. We're learning all the time better ways to do it. And this year's policies again are like still rolling out. So a majority of districts have made their policies publicly available, but not all. And so it's an ongoing kind of process of data collection and reanalysis. It's like a cycle.
And can you, just as I don't want to take up all the time, but can you also share a little bit about so each district has their own set of goals, et cetera, which they need to put together in order to get the money that they qualify for. But what are the state's conditions? Like, they must have to meet some state bar, right? What does the state require? Like, is there ever been a district that didn't get the money because they didn't write a set of goals or a plan that passed the state's requirements?
So far, I'm not aware of districts that have their funding cut off, but there are districts who have been failing to meet their targets, the goals that they set for themselves. Like, one of the interesting things about this policy is it's a kind of bottom-up accountability thing. Every district sets the goals that it's going to be held accountable to. And when a district fails to meet its accountability targets, instead of the state government coming down and punishing them, which is kind of no child left behind model for how accountability works, there's a separate office at the state level of basically like consultants and support staff that they send into districts to help them address their problems and devise strategies for meeting their goals. So that process works. In general, though, what I can say is there's a whole lot of time and person power spent producing these documents, these LCAPs, that are then impossible to work with and read and are very opaque, and it's not clear to me. I've had discussion. This is being recorded. More can be done to like get value out of this process at the state level, I would say.
Great. So unless there are, great. So unless there are other questions, I think the plan is to take a quick bathroom break and then move on to the panel. So 5-minute break. We will restart by 11:20 with the policy panel. Thank you.
Sorry again for going over time. Poor form.
We have 3 panelists. We have Dan Torres and Shuming Cheer and Manuel Pastor. And I was thinking we would go in order: Dan, Manuel, and Shuming. Does that seem okay? Okay. So first of all, thank you all for being here. I think I'll do a brief introduction for each of you in turn. So thank you, first of all of you, for being here today to participate in this workshop and share your thoughts. First of all, we have Dan Torres, who is the Program Director of Immigrant Rights for the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund. And he has a very distinguished career. He was Special Assistant on Immigrant Rights to California Attorney General Xavier Becerra, and was California's first Director of Immigrant Integration, as a state-level cabinet position. He was staff attorney with the California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and he was chief of Immigration Services, the Immigration Services branch with the California Department of Social Services. So thank you very much Dan, for being here today to share your thoughts.
Thank you, Marianne, for inviting me. And thank you to all the researchers. Your presentations were excellent, and really, your research is very valuable for the moment that we're in. And so I just thank you for your hard work. Just some observations first about the presentations, and then we could talk about areas I think that we need to explore. I thought, it's so poignant to hear about the needs where we're at with farm workers and DACA and the safety net. All of these issues right now are live in terms of policy debates in Congress and federal executive policymaking and policymaking at the state level. And I really appreciated the points about the challenges we faced during COVID regarding with DACA as well. Students who have had to navigate the uncertainty of DACA, but also the challenges with staying in school because of COVID. And so I think areas of work, I think that perhaps in the future can be helpful. With farm work, the House passed the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. And I think that's an area that I could use additional analysis about what would be the impact of such legislation on the workforce in places like California. Some folks raise questions about like the H2A, or excuse me, the portability of visas. There's a piece to this legislation that's going to look at making H2A portable for workers, so the ability to move between employers, and that would be an innovation I think that would be interesting to see. To the point that the research raised about how to make sure that there are jobs that are attractive to people. I think the freedom of movement and freedom to have choice in your employer, I think would be very impactful. And I think that analysis would be helpful. In terms of DACA, I would be interested in seeing more research about where we go next. I mean, DACA itself faces an uncertain future. It's at the Fifth Circuit, the litigation out of Texas is facing, the Texas judge issued an injunction finding DACA unlawful. The litigation going, to the Court of Appeal and then the Supreme Court also looks very uncertain for DACA. So what is, I'd be interested in learning more about what that's doing to DACA recipients today, building on the research that Reem has done. What does that mean for students moving forward? What choices are they going to have to make? And then in terms of policy implications for the state and federal policymakers, if we don't have federal immigration reform, what else can we do to support that population to stay in the workforce? Is it looking at more entrepreneurship training, more support to open up a business on your own? So you're not, if you lose work authorization, you have some choices to survive as a self-employed worker. Those are the things that are looming large in my mind about where we go next if we don't have DACA anymore and we don't have a pathway to citizenship that's been approved by Congress and President. I really appreciated as well the research about the safety net. What we saw across the board during COVID is the need, to Chloe's point, we need more mechanisms to help families survive, whether it's the pandemic or whether it's wildfires, whether it's climate change. There's so many different catastrophes our families are facing, but we don't have the mechanisms to keep them afloat during these hard times. And I think I really appreciate the point about needing to change that narrative. I think an area of research to make that stick, though, is going to be perhaps more interdisciplinary to look at how surrounding communities think about that challenge. And to Chloe's point, it's a shared challenge. It impacts everyone around the impacted communities. So I would be interested in figuring out how we can mitigate the grievance politics that has emerged when we help undocumented immigrants, especially those that are hit the hardest, so that we can make these policies stick and people understand the bigger picture and why they have a shared interest and making sure that people have supports during these difficult times. And then, to Jacob's point about students and families vanishing in the K-12 system, and also, as we talked about with higher ed, the challenge ahead for us will be, how do we get folks back in to school and back, into higher ed? And what would be the mechanisms to make sure that we address all of the challenges they face, including, we saw lots of families say, I need my kid to help me work. We can't survive. We have no safety net. We can't continue to send them to school. Or they had childcare problems or challenges. They had lots of insecurities. But now the question, after we get out of this pandemic, is how do we get people back on track? And there are some interesting things that are happening at the state level with, employment-aligned learning opportunities that perhaps could be built on to really and integrated with immigrant serving institutions, because those are opportunities where people can both work, earn some income at a place that an employer that is also providing training that's aligned with what they're learning in school. So those models, I think, could be further developed and like I said, more aligned with immigrant communities. So I could go on. I think the public charge conversation to Chloe's research, I think that's going to be critical to inform the new policy making that's happening at the federal level with the proposed regulation that's overturning so much harm that's been caused by the Trump version of public charge, reversing the chilling effects and getting people to feel safe again. To especially those U.S. citizen children who have been cut out of safety net benefits because of the chilling effect. Reversing that, I think, doing research to figure out how to message that to communities and make it and explain the new policy will be helpful in the future. And I'll stop there.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. I think I'm going to go through each speaker and then we can open it up for discussion amongst the research presenters and the rest of the audience. So I'm going to go on to Manuel Pastor, who is a distinguished professor of sociology and the inaugural holder of the Turpingen Chair in Civil Society and Social Change at the University of Southern California. He's also the director of the University of Southern California's California Equity Research Institute, and he's a member of Governor Newsom's Council of Economic Advisors. He has a long history of running numerous centers related to, broadly speaking, equity in California. He was the founding director of the Center for Justice, Tolerance, and Community at the University of Santa Cruz. And he has also written numerous books that are particularly relevant to California's vulnerable populations, including Equity, Growth, and Community, What the Nation Can Learn from America's Metro Areas, and a recent book, Solidarity Economics, Why Mutuality of Movements Matter. So thank you very much, Manuel, for sharing your thoughts about this topic.
Great, glad to be with you. I will confess, Marianne asked me, can you come and comment at the end? I said, well, I can't join till about 10:30. She said, still come and comment. So let me just say that all of you were brilliant. I could tell from the general reaction. And what I want to do is to share some things about what we might think about going forward. And I guess I'll do sort of 5 things quickly. One is a little bit about what Dan raised about narrative. And one of the things that I found to be the most effective at getting policymakers and others to be concerned about the situation of undocumented immigrants in California is to point out that, for example, in LA County, 18% of the population is either undocumented themselves or living with a family member who is. So that's not a small share of our population. And the reason why we have such mixed status families is because in Los Angeles, the share of undocumented immigrants who've been in the country for longer than a decade is 70%. In California, it's about 2/3. So those are undocumented Californians, deeply rooted, mixed status families, embedded in businesses, embedded in communities with all the ripple effects that folks are talking about. Second, so what do we need in terms of a narrative going forward is, I think, to continue to use the term undocumented Californians. Second, going forward, we need to recognize that the migration flow is about to change in several different ways. But one of the most important ways it's about to change is the fact that we're going to be getting a lot more climate refugees. That is, people will be making the trek from Central America who are fleeing climate crises there and who are fleeing violence in the Northern Triangle. And we'll be getting other refugees as well. And what is different about that, it's a lot more women and children, and it's a lot less Mexican adult males ready to jump into the labor force. And so the arguments we've been using about immigrants being contributors, for these new immigrants, they will eventually be contributors, their kids will be contributors, but they're going to be users of the safety net in order to be able to contribute. And we need to shift our language from immigrants as deserving because they contribute to immigrants as deserving because they are human beings and they are in difficult circumstances. Third thing I would say is that, by the way, this doesn't mean that Giovanni's excellent work shouldn't continue. His work has been so important about showing the contribution of immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, and also showing the positive ripple effect on the rest of the labor market. So we need to continue to do that, but we need to nuance it by understanding the climate forces that are going to get different people arriving at our metaphorical shores. Third big point is to understand something about our economy going forward, which is just as much as we will be probably blessed by people who have H-1B visas. We're about 12% of the country's population, but we've got 20 to 25% of the H-1B visa holders. And we've got high tech and biotech and education with all sorts of so-called high skill immigrants. That it's important to realize that behind every software engineer is an army of nannies and food service workers and gardeners. And that one of the biggest concentrations of undocumented Californians in the state is the Silicon Valley, because that population requires a lot of service work that gets the label low skill. Now, if you've ever taken care of children, that's a skill. If you've ever actually tried to be a good janitor, that's a skill. If you've ever actually tried to wash dishes, that's a skill. I know we call it low skill because it's low wage, but we need to be doing, and I think Giovanni asked the question, talking about how it's important to be raising the minimum wage, how it's important to be protecting working conditions, because our economy going forward is not just hourglass in terms of inequalities. It is actually these two kind of labors coexist. If you want your fresh organic strawberries, you need farm workers who are in the state, who have a lot of skills. If you want your busy software engineers, you need a care economy that can care for elders, care for children, etc. And we need a new language and a new framework around all the skills that we need. Fourth big trend going forward is the aging of our population and decomposing that aging. It is easy when we talk about an aging California to imagine that it is what we currently think it is. That is, that our elderly population is overwhelmingly white. Our young population is overwhelmingly people of color. and that the past is the future. But if you look at the demographic projections from the state of California, and they don't break it down by immigration, but they do break it down by race, ethnic group. If you move forward from year 2020 to the year 2060, the median age of whites is barely going to budge. And if it budges, it'll be budging down to being younger. The people who will be getting old, whose median age is increasing, are Black slightly, Asian more, Latino by a lot. And in fact, the median age gap, which now is about 17 years between whites and Latinos, will shrink to about 2 years. So if you look at who our seniors will be, they will be a lot of Latino, Black, and Asian seniors, as well as white seniors. And we don't see it because our current thinking is white old people, young folks of color. But what that means is that unless we address the wealth inequality issues right now, we're going to have huge retirement burdens, because we will have a social safety net for the old, for folks who haven't had a chance to accumulate their own 401ks or home ownership opportunities now. So we need to be shifting a lot of our thinking to wealth accumulation for these populations. Last point, which I think will be very important for policy, again, it's a shift from the past. We have been a state that has been blessed by the arrival of immigrants, the entrepreneurship that they bring, the workforce, higher rates of workforce attachment that were talked about earlier, the fact that most folks arrive completely educated, so we didn't pay for that, and they wind up contributing directly into the workforce. So we are not used to competing for immigrants, but we're going to have to, because if we want our economy to do well and our society to thrive, we are going to need more immigrants in the state. And we're going to have to move away from an attitude that's all talk and no action. We're a welcoming state, we're a sanctuary state, we're not going to deport you. All of that stuff's good. But if you can't afford a house, if you aren't being well paid, if the local control funding formula isn't actually effective at driving funding to your children, you're going to move to Texas, because they might talk shit about you, but at least you can buy a house, find a job, and find schools that your kid can go to. So we actually need a much more coherent strategic plan for immigrant integration that is about a California for all. And believe it or not, I just did that in less than 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Manuel. Let's go to our last panelist, Xiuming Qie, who is the Deputy Director of Programs and Campaigns at the California Immigrant Policy Center. Xiuming has a law degree from UCLA, and she serves as an adjunct professor at the UCLA School of Law, in addition to her role as deputy director. And she also has a very long list of important accolades, which includes representing over 800 immigrants facing deportation through her work at various organizations, including the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project in Arizona and the Catholic Legal Immigration Network's Los Angeles Detention Project. Another accolade is that she was director of movement building and strategic partnerships for the National Immigration Law Center. That's just a short version. All of the folks that I'm introducing, I'm giving you little windows into their many credentials. But Xiuming, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the invitation. So I feel like it definitely makes sense that I'm following what Manuel was just sharing, because I'm going to focus on CIPC, California Immigrant Policy Center's work to advance an immigrant equity budget this year. And some of the context and analysis for why we're doing this have already been touched on by many of you, including the fact that we see that in California, racial and economic inequalities are not getting smaller. In fact, they're growing. and that this is not a recent phenomenon. It's not just COVID that's caused these inequalities, but it's really decades-long systematic exclusions, both on the federal level as well as on the state level. And so we've seen that immigrant communities are still really reeling from the Great Recession, from inflation, from the climate of fear left behind by the Trump administration also. And we also, recognize that currently the state has a huge budget surplus. Recently, it was 31 billion, and I think just this week I heard that actually it's higher than that. It's $43.7 billion surplus this year. And we know that much of that surplus is generated by the labor of working class people and immigrants. And so what we really want to call on the state to do is to have an equitable recovery that really looks at people who have been excluded from many state structures, many state programs, and that this type of recovery will help all Californians by building a more resilient economy. And so another piece of what we're looking at is also the fact that California likes to pride itself as being a leader on racial justice. So as Manuel just mentioned, let's see some action to back that up, not just rhetoric. And so what we want to call on the state to do is to invest $2.5 billion of the surplus into programs that directly benefit immigrants. So there's 3 programs that we're looking at specifically. The first one is looking at a safety net for all. As Chloe mentioned in her presentation, because of the many exclusions of workers from unemployment insurance, we want to make the state create an excluded workers fund. So similar to what has happened in New York, New Jersey, and other states, this would be a program where workers who are undocumented and therefore don't qualify for unemployment insurance would be getting $300 a week for up to 20 weeks. And those numbers reflect the average benefit amount and length of unemployment for California's undocumented workers. And so the total cost for this program, we're asking for a 1-year pilot program so that we can study the impact and the best practices. And that total cost would be $690 million. The second prong of our immigrant equity budget is looking at food for all. We want to ensure that all income eligible Californians age 55 and older, and depending on how far we can push, maybe people beyond that age group can qualify for the California Food Assistance Program, regardless of their status. We've seen food insecurity really increasing during the pandemic, even for students in college. And so we want to make sure that immigrants have access to food benefits. The third piece is the remaining portions of our Health for All campaign. You might all be aware that over the last 5 years, over several years, there's been many advances around making sure that all income eligible California residents can have access to Medi-Cal, regardless of their immigration status. So through the Health for All campaign, we were able to secure access for kids ages 0 to 18, young adults ages 19 to 25, and the last year for people ages 50 and over. So there's still that gap of people between the ages of 26 to 49 who are undocumented and are not able to access Medi-Cal. And so what we want the state to do is to close that gap and make sure that people in that age range have access to Medi-Cal. So those are the 3 planks of our immigrant equity budget. We have started advocating with state legislatures around that. And we also put out a sign-on letter that over 150 groups sign on to. So we plan to keep putting on the pressure, making sure that the state can really put this investment in immigrant communities. And we're also looking long-term at divest, really looking at how we can lift up the asks of allies in the criminal reform, decarceration, policing reform spaces, to see how do we shift money away from harmful institutions and put the money then into actual community support programs like the ones that I just mentioned.
Thank you so much, Shuming. I was thinking, I know Giovanni is going to run the Q&A, but I thought we might want to start by just giving the presenters we had earlier an opportunity to comment or ask questions of the panelists, and then we could open it up to broader chat. Does that make sense, Giovanni?
Yes, sure. Yes. So if the presenters would like to react to some of those thoughts that the panel had, please go ahead. Either raise the hand or unmute yourself. Yes, Jacob.
I want to hear your reaction, Giovanni. Can I put in a request? I want to hear about Professor Pastore's comments.
I am happy to have a reaction, but I just want to make sure that everybody has a reaction too. So let me wait a second, and I definitely am happy to say a couple of things.
Oh, well, I'll jump in then.
Yes, please.
But I appreciate the prompt, Jake, because I'm curious too. So I appreciated all the comments. There are just a couple that I thought might be useful to follow up on. So Dan, your comment about the public charge rule, and I know that folks are working to put together comments right now about suggestions for that going forward, which is something that I think is really important. And you had mentioned in that reversing the chilling effects that have happened in the last decade or so. And to me, that is something that is really important and something that I actually think we have very little research on. I think we know a lot about the harm that these policies can do and much less about how we can reverse the harm. And so I hope that that's something that research can work on going forward, and something that I'm actively interested in some of my work too, is trying to sort of figure out, for example, like who are the best messengers to provide information, who are trusted messengers, what is the information that's needed, what can we communicate to the states to reduce fear when individuals go in and actually apply for programs. I think that there's a lot of different dimensions that that we can learn more about and hopefully work on going forward. And then I appreciated the comments both by you and Manuel about changing the rhetoric. That's something I've been thinking about a lot, and it was really useful to hear your thoughts about that. And then I just want to end by saying that the work that you're doing, Xiuming in California, is very exciting to me, and I'd love to follow up and chat with you more about that, because I think that sounds really important, and yeah, I'd love to talk more about that. Thanks.
Just quickly, Chloe, I would also just a shout out to Xiuming and CIPC. They're actually working on narrative change work as well, looking at public charge questions. So lots of potential partnerships there for sure.
Yeah, that's something. So in the work that I've been doing with CTAN, that's something we've been talking about a lot. So I'd love to connect with you on that. That'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. And thanks, Dan. That reminded me to share that. Yeah, we just recently came out with a publication around narrative change. And so I'll be happy to share that with you in terms of talking about, like, what are the ways in which we think we can help to shift some of the discourse about immigrants and prevent this othering or demonization that so often happens.
Great, thanks.
So let me jump in here, and I have just I also have a question actually for all of you, but I wanted to follow up on a couple of things that Manuel said, because I actually think that I agree, and so I like this idea that given that we are an economy of immigrants, the California and immigrants have contributed so much from Silicon Valley to the Central Valley, from the manual type of services to the very intellectual, and so there is a real economic contribution. I like that our immigration system also affords us to have some immigrant who will need some initial investment instead. I always have thought that the right immigration system is a balanced one, in which you have some people who come and are ready to contribute to the economy, but another part in which there are real crises in the world, and there are really some people who in the immediate are displaced, and they will be maybe more because of climate, because of wars. And I think that California, the United States, but California has the strength and has the vision, should have the vision of allowing some, which are in the short run an investment as I see it, and in the long run potential advantages, also have a potential gain in the longer run. And we should admit them because they're humans. I totally agree on that too. We should not always see, but clearly the economic contribution is real and is a potential for convincing people. I have a question for all of you, because you touched the two topics which I think are crucial in California in particular. One is one of the problem in California is this of housing, of the incredible price of housing. And the COVID has seemed to indicate that some jobs maybe can be done remotely. And maybe Silicon Valley is a huge agglomeration, but maybe some of the high human capital people will de-agglomerate from them because the prices are too high. And with them, as Manuel will say, maybe there will be much less need, because Silicon Valley needs also cooks and household people. There will be less need for this labor. So here, it seems to me that one question and one solution is housing for low-income people. This will be a massive help for immigrants, more housing, more construction of housing in California. To me, this seems to be a first-order type of issue. The urban area in California are becoming unlivable for some of the low-income people because of this. And so is this really a policy that one should push and is good for everybody? But for the immigrant community that is particularly concentrated in cities, and also has a lot of these service workers who live in cities with not very high income, could be a really important one. And the second is the climate change migration that we mentioned. Maybe is happening within California too. The fires, the Central Valley is becoming, in many places, there are locations which are at risk of surviving a long summer and long fire season. And maybe there will be an internal mobility in California. I don't know, more of these people will come in the urban area, will move out. How do you see that dynamic, of course, which is affecting and has affected immigrants massively, agricultural sector massively, but also all California? What are there some interesting idea or interesting perspective there to try to deal with that?
So I'll add say three things. One is I really like the way you framed California being strong enough to invest in newcomers who may not jump in immediately into the labor market. Really like that. Second, the housing issue is absolutely crucial, and it was crucial to COVID because it was a combination of the kind of jobs people had and then the overcrowded housing conditions in which they lived. So if anybody got it at work, it spread quite rapidly to all family members. And it's also a common ground issue. And Shaming may remember that we wrote a piece with CIPC on housing as being an immigrant issue. It's something that needs to be lifted up. So I think that's something where there's a common ground interest, but it's specific. And then on the climate piece that you're mentioning, another piece of that is who has access to assistance after a climate disaster. So with the wildfires, there was a lot of vulnerability for immigrants, undocumented immigrants in particular, who got pushed out of housing and employment, but had no place to fall back on. And that is an important role for the state in terms of its climate planning.
I will add that housing, yeah, absolutely. We're seeing it in real time right now with refugee resettlement. It is a huge challenge to find housing for Afghans. And we're looking at potentially, bigger challenges as well ahead with Ukrainian refugee resettlement. Even though they're situated in a different place than a lot of other, as you pointed out earlier, or Chloe pointed out too, they're coming in with refugee status or some access to public benefits, but yet the housing stock is not there to even give them a placement. So it's having impacts there. Farm workers as well. We don't have a whole lot of housing stock for farm workers, even though in the H2A context, employers are required to provide that. But as Diana pointed out, there are places where the local communities are not welcoming. They don't want to have more H2A housing provided. So I think housing is something that needs a lot more attention. And then on the climate migration, there are some conversations nationally about, creating pathways to citizenship or protections that recognize climate migration, sort of in the way that Europe has been thinking about complementary protections that is outside of the sort of framework of traditional asylum and refugee protections, which, as you know, are limited to 5 different types of statuses, but that don't recognize climate. So, broadening the sort of availability of protections, I think, is another direction that policy should go.
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly that yes, I definitely think we do need to have more affordable housing, and it's one piece of a very complicated puzzle where we also need stronger protections for tenants and increased taxes for certain types of property sales. Somebody was just recently telling me that they're trying to get a measure on the ballot here in Los Angeles to increase taxes on the sales of properties over $5 million. So I think also looking at the ways in which we can increase revenue by shifting the burden onto those who are really, the millionaires, the billionaires, and then looking long term too about how do we raise the floor for wages, how do we increase benefits on the job, how do we just create a stronger social safety net so that people are not living so precariously and not able to either afford to buy a home or to continue paying their rent.
Thank you. Any other, at this point, maybe one more question, one final comment question from presenters or any of the audience?
One thing super
Yes.
quick is it's going to be really interesting to see, Giovanni, how much de-agglomeration really goes on. Because of we're really at the turning point now where we're going to see whether or not most of that movement was within California, still gets into the declustering that you were talking about, but whether or not there's going to be some movement back, and then will the immigrants follow who do the service work into, for example, the Sierras, and how that changes the demography and politics of those areas as well. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to track.
Yeah, I agree, Manuel. I think this is a very, yes, a very interesting dynamic is going to be, and clearly a lot of these services that follow sort of the high-end manufacturing can be maybe reshuffled, and immigrants are going to be so important for those. To me, these bottlenecks, these shortages that are happening right now are themselves the sign that things is reallocating, demand is reallocating, and it's not finding the supply to satisfy this. So we'll see how this works for the immigrant communities in the next 5 years. Great. So I think we have come to the end of our presentation and panel. I'm gonna leave. On my hand, I just want to thank the presenters for an excellent job and very stimulating and interesting presentation, and the panelists for a very interesting perspective and very informative for us. I think it's useful to have sometimes this back and forth so that policy involved people know what research goes on, and we know what are the interesting things and what are the policy challenges and how to translate. So this was done in a little workshop, but I think is a interesting and scalable model that we'll try to replicate. For now, thanks to all of you guys. I'm going to leave Marianne to close the event. It was wonderful to see many of you come back also to the center, which is great, and many new colleagues and friends. Marianne.
I think I have one word to say, which is ditto. Everything, this was fantastic. Thank you very much. We are recording this. I know Jessica will reach out to make sure it's okay with all of you that we post it, but if you want to go back to see, to revisit some of this conversation, it will almost certainly end up being posted as well. So assuming you all agree to that. So please share it with your colleagues and other folks you interact with as you think it may be useful. And again, many thanks to all of you for sharing your research and your knowledge with this group.
Thank you, guys. Bye. Thank you. Thank you so much.